Firstly, it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today and to be able to talk with you. And I'm delighted you've agreed to take part in this podcast. Could you introduce me to yourself and what you do and how you became in your role?
I'm a neuroscientist. I was trained in Cuba. The research institute from which many other research institutes were created was the National Research Centre. 1965 was created by Fidel, and a group of medical doctors or people who, at the point of graduation, were recruited to train in biomedical research and in biotechnology. And I joined that group, and this was at the 70s, 71. And I started working with a Mexican researcher that had come to Cuba to teach in medical school. Many people came from all over South America to help with those first years, and they worked in the medical school and carry out research. And this professor, Talia Harmony, was very interested in neurophysiology and the practical applications of neuroscience. And I got involved with that lab. Then we spent a couple of years studying in the National Research Centre, which is, as I said, the founding organization, the mother organization for all the other centers. And we studied for 2 years math, chemistry, physical chemistry, basic science to prepare us for a future career in research. And I trained then as a neuroscientist, and I headed a group inside the National Research Centre dedicated to neuroscience. And then this group grew and then branched off into an independent organization, which is the Cuban Center for Neuroscience. This happened with many other centers, the Center for Genetic Engineering, the Center for Immunoassay. So it's a long list of, that was like a nursery, a place where people began doing research, and they would create their groups, train their groups, then branch off. And that's something that allowed, in a very short time, for many new research centers to be created. In fact, Dr. Talia Harmony was the first person in Cuba that obtained a PhD. She had training, of course, in Mexico with other scientists, and she completed her work here. And the tribunal brought together people from around the world because there were no PhDs in Cuba. So people from United States, a scientist came, people from Russia, Czechoslovakia, from different parts of the world. And one of the good things about knowledge is that it can grow exponentially. So it's not only the bad things like bacteria or viruses, there was an exponential growth, and then Talia started training other people. Those people trained others, and then now we have many, many PhDs in Cuba. And out of that first research center, a lot of other centers were born.
That's great. So you talked about the centre being set up in 1965, very early, just a few years after the revolution. But already in 1960, January 1960, a year since the revolution took power, Fidel Castro went to the Academy of Sciences and said, the future of Cuba will be a future of people of science. We need thinking people who will put their intelligence to justice and the development of the nation. And, at that time, illiteracy was so high in Cuba, the record of scientific research was poor, educational levels were very low. So this must have seemed crazy, but of course that was followed up by real investments in science and technology. How important has that been post-1959 in the form of socialist development that's existed in Cuba?
I have to mention that I was born in the United States and I grew up in the United States. And I came to Cuba in 1961. And all my cousins, we have a large family, were in the countryside teaching people to read and write in the anti-illiteracy campaign. And at that moment, thinking of science as the basis of economy seemed like, a dream. And when this first research center, the National Research Center, was being constructed, I was still in medical school. Some of my grumpy old professors, would look and say, it's a white elephant. That's never going to be really useful. They saw it as really as a pipe dream, something that was not a real route for development. But the reality is that a sector, important sector of Cuba's knowledge economy is based on knowledge, and the biotech sector has now contributed substantially to the economic development of Cuba. So it's, for example, the organization I belong to is exporting to over 60 countries. Cuba's vaccines against COVID were very important in several countries. The vaccination campaigns were carried out using Cuban vaccines. And of course, the ability to manufacture vaccines in Cuba allowed us to do things that we wouldn't have been able to vaccinate almost 100% of our population if it weren't for the fact that we had this capability of designing and building our own vaccines. So of course, there's a cascade of events after the anti-illiteracy campaign when everybody practically learned to read and write. And it's what was called the battle for the sixth grade, which is that everyone should have primary school, and that there were night schools and people were studying. And then the creation of many universities. So Cuba used to have 3 universities, one in the western part, one in the center, one in the eastern part. And Cuba started creating new universities. And now in each of all of our provinces, we have several universities, because there's the medical university, there's the technical university. And all of this, I think, is a cascade of events that responds to a very clear policy. It's a political will to develop the country, to train the people, and to know that the best resource of our country is its human resources. And I think a critical decision was when Fidel and the leadership of the Cuba started seeing that there were more doctors, more engineers, more scientists, more research groups. He started thinking about how that could be turned into an asset for the economic development. And we had we were observing what was happening in other countries, European countries, the Soviet Union, and the slow pace at which scientific discoveries were being introduced into practice, into society. And then Fidel had this idea of what he called full cycle research centers. And the idea is that the research centers would develop their own production facilities, their own companies for foreign commerce, for importing and exporting. And this was a radical departure with the conception of how the economy should be organized that was prevalent in all the old socialist bloc. So it's a sequence of steps that we're taking in a grand strategy, and that one of the important ideas was this final idea of, okay, we now have the research centers. After people learn to read and write, more universities, people at the higher educational level, research centers, what's the next step? And of course, Cuba did not have a sector of the economy where there were entrepreneurs that were familiar with biotechnology, with scientists. Okay, let's organize like a massive spin-off operation. All these research centers will create their own companies and their own production facilities. And that's one of the reasons that I think the Cuban biotech story is very successful. And it's part of a grand strategy. We owe a lot of this to Fidel and the way he wanted to help develop Cuba.
The Neuroscience Centre is one of over 50 medical science centres that are part of the Western Havana Scientific Pole. Most of these are organised under the BioPharma Cuba umbrella. Can you explain what this is and how it works?
Okay. BioCubaFarma is like a state holding organization that helps coordinate work of the different centers. We have the Center for Genetic Engineering, the Center for Molecular Immunology, the Center for Design of Pharmaceuticals, the 36 units. And each of these units has a great deal of autonomy. So, for example, we set up our own plans as a center, and most of the other centers import and export directly. I say the degree of autonomy is very large, but having a holding organization helps us in several things. For example, in several countries, we've set up offices or small or additional companies that represent all the centers. And this, of course, makes a lot of sense. It's much more economical than if each center tried to work independently in other countries. For example, just to mention one important example, in Mexico, we have a company that represents all of the BioCubaFarma organizations. So when we sold COVID vaccines to Mexico, it was through this company. But if we're selling medical equipment, we do it, and we have permanent staff there, and that makes a lot of sense. Another example is China. China is very far away. We have a permanent staff there that's is BioCubaFarma, that represents all of the other centers. We have, of course, people that we send and do work specifically for one center, but the idea of a coordinating organization is very good. And they also have funds, because, if you have a company and you're doing business and you're producing and selling, you have good moments and bad moments. And then they have a fund that helps the individual centers survive, let's say, if they have a bad period of results, which is very, very frequent, because in the biotech industry, all the products take a very long time to develop. And let's say you have a product which is been accepted in the market, it's solving problems, but then the competition could create something, and then you have to redesign and produce your new product. And then there could be some slumps there, and then part of that slack is taken up by this umbrella organization that has funds to help the centers. But the degree of autonomy is very large.
I mean, you talked about the sort of kind of unique role of BioCubaFarma, but I mean, stepping back, the way that the biotech sector in Cuba was founded is quite exceptional. It was founded by state funding, state investment, it's state owned. There are no private speculative interests involved. And it's also recognised to be highly productive and innovative, including world leading in some areas. And we'd be happy for you to expand more on that. We have some questions later. But in a way, the important thing about that is it counters the myth that only profit-seeking private interest through competition can lead to these sort of innovative or productive results. So what are, for you, from the inside, from the Cuban perspective, what are the benefits of having a state-run medical science sector?
I mean, there's certain basic things that really should trump any consideration of profit. If you have a pandemic, like say the COVID, people are dying, and I mean, we've all a little recovered from that. But I remember the toughest times of the COVID. You were seeing on television doctors deciding if this patient or this other patient will receive the help with a ventilator, and that's the kind of situation where profit has to come secondary. It has to be secondary to saving lives. And also, the health of a nation depends on many things. For example, all the populations of the world are aging, and there are a lot of chronic disorders, chronic illnesses. And that means there are people that have to have their drugs against diabetes, hypertension, every day. And if the prices of this become prohibitive, then the population's health will deteriorate. So one of the advantages for Cuba of having the state-owned and state-run organization is that a top priority is producing and supplying drugs, medicine, vaccines at prices that are really accessible to everyone. Cuba's medicine produced by BioCubaFarma is heavily subsidized. The government helps. But the fact that there's we don't have these stockholders that want a lot of profit, that means that we can keep the prices low. And this is something that the whole world is now with a dilemma that a large percentage of the population will grow very old. And the population, let's say, of younger people at working age will shrink compared to that large population. This is unsustainable if you don't have some sort of mechanism, right, to give people what they need at affordable prices. The other thing is, I think something sometimes overlooked, is that when a person's relationship with his health provider and with the drug producers is not based on the idea they're ripping me off and they're getting rich, there's a lot of more confidence. Mm-hmm. The question is, why does Cuba have such high vaccination rates? Why there's no anti-vax movement in Cuba? And part of it is, I think, education, but a part of it is also that there's no adversarial relationships between clients, which would be the patients, and then organizations that are trying to siphon out, a lot of profit. And then that has led that the Cuban population has a large confidence, very large confidence in its health system and its providers of medicines, drugs, vaccines. So the things you're seeing in some parts of the world today, that there's this skepticism on vaccines, distrust of what the scientists are saying, this is not, I think, the case of Cuba. And during the COVID vaccine, one of the things that allowed us to become one of the countries with the lowest rate of infection and lowest, let's say, death rate due to COVID is that the public trusted their health authorities. And when I say health authorities, I mean the doctors, the Ministry of Health, but also the providers of drugs, which they don't see as part of, let's say, this corporate group of people trying to get money, but they see it as part of the health system, part of providing health.
Can I just, and to clarify on that, would that also mean the type of drugs the type of illnesses that you would develop drugs for, would that also have an impact on that?
Sometimes there are diseases that are rare, and then they're abandoned. That's the list of abandoned diseases. And then one of the things about having its, let's say, more solidarity in the idea of how you do biotech is that you don't really abandon some diseases. And since this also can fit into government policies, I'll just give an example. There are diseases in Africa where the big drug producers or vaccine producers have lost interest in attacking those problems. And Cuba, through government programs with the World Health Organization, has established work in that direction. That one example is meningitis B. Meningitis B in Africa is a serious problem. There's what's called the meningitis belt. It's an area. And for a long time, nobody was interested in producing, because there were no epidemics in the rich countries. But Cuba, with its Finlay Institute, did develop, we had our meningitis B vaccine, and together with the World Health Organization and different other international organizations, and it's part of our government policy to collaborate with the health systems in other countries, did work on that. So I think that's an additional advantage. So it's not just where the money is driving things, but also what are the needs. And that's the sort of thing that governments have to take care of.
Mm-hmm. just go back a bit on the COVID pandemic. So Cuba's biomedical institution collaborated and made an important contribution to Cuba's integral response. What was the specific contribution of the Neuroscience Centre?
Okay. Well, first I'd like to say that this is an example where public trust has a beneficial effect for everything. Because the first battle with COVID we had was delaying the peak of the epidemic. And all the renowned experts here, like people in the Ministry of Public Health, daily would inform how many people were living in Cuba, how they were evolving, if they're getting better, who was getting worse. And everyone, from the president down, everybody, president, all television, let's say anchors, everybody would use their mask. So the fact that there was a consistent message and that everybody contributed gave us space to work, time to work. And that had effects, positive effects, because it allows us to develop in time the vaccine. And our center, the Cuban Center for Neuroscience, does research on the brain, but we also produce equipment, medical equipment. For example, systems to study the electroencephalograph, and we do it with computerized techniques, systems for early detection of hearing loss, and there's a tradition of working with medical equipment. So when the COVID pandemic started creating this situation of, I'd say, unease, and everybody was really, really scared because we were seeing terrible scenes in Italy, in the United States, in New York, everywhere. All the big scientific centers were met with the president, and there was a discussion of what we could do. And we decided that our contribution could be in equipment and in medical devices. So one of the things we did was develop ventilators. This was a work we did with several other research institutes, Grito del Aire, Centro Inmunensayo, so other centers. And we collaborated. The government organized these periodic discussions of what to do, and we collaborated, and we managed to get some open source designs for ventilators. One from MIT in the U.S., the other from UCL in the UK. And it's interesting that in a situation of crisis, everybody got very generous. All these scientists shared because it was saving lives. So I think the basic thing in most people, in their nature, human nature, is let's help. And then we managed to buy some of the components. Very difficult because the exact design of the MIT we couldn't we couldn't use because the components were from the U.S. We had to search for alternative components because of the blockade, this economic war against Cuba. But we managed to get the components. And in the case of the UK, there was even a crowdfunding organized by one of the doctors there, a Cuban doctor that lives in the UK. She's married to a scientist, a British scientist. And there was a crowdfunding, and they managed to raise money that they contributed for this. Because I'd like to remind everyone that this economic war in Cuba is real. And when we started preparing for the COVID epidemic, we saw that we had ventilators that had problems because they were broken down, they needed spare parts. And some of the companies we bought ventilators from have been acquired by US companies. So automatically, they just wouldn't help us. We managed to manufacture 250 ventilators of the MIT design and 250 ventilators of the UCL design. And some of them were being finished at the precise moment we had the first big peak, the one that in the province of Matanzas. So People were working here until very late at night, and they would finish a ventilator, put it in an ambulance, and it would go directly to the hospital to be used. And I think we managed to contribute with us and the other centers that were collaborating to save a few lives with this. And the other thing we did is, of course, they were doing swabs, throat swabs and nose swabs, to test for the COVID virus. And the prices of simple swabs soared. It was it would have meant a drain on Cuban finances, which is always in a difficult situation, thanks to our neighbors in the north. And so the first thing we did is we set up a manufacturing of these swabs, a semi-manual. What we did is we got motors, the ones they used in stomatology, in dentistry, and then we would apply this polyester fibers, and then we started manufacturing semi-manually with a bank of these little motors, and that was the first response. And then, thanks to the generous collaboration of the European Union, PAHO, and other organizations, we managed to buy and in a record time set up a production line for these swabs. And the other thing we did in very short time with the same external financial help was manufacturing masks. And we set up these two factories in 6 months, and they were producing. So when the peak came, we had that in place. So I'll go back to the beginning and say what I said at the beginning. The fact that we managed to delay the peak gave us time to do all of this. If the peak would have hit us before, we would have had more loss of life and a lot of people very ill.
Thanks for that answer. The Neuroscience Centre played an important role in COVID, but prior to that, there was also a sort of key moment for yourself and the Neuroscience Centre, and that was related to the incidents in 2017 when the Trump administration withdrew half of its staff from the US Embassy in Havana on the unfounded allegations that its personnel was suffering from some kind of sonic attacks. That later became microwaves, which later became the Havana syndrome. So the importance of that was that it laid the foundation for a rupture in relations. It completely reversed the rapprochement under Obama, and it paved the way for the imposition of severe sanctions, which have led to this acute economic crisis that we see today. So you played a key role on the team of scientists who responded to those US allegations. Can you tell us what your investigation found and how your findings were received by the US side and internationally?
I have to say that the Cuban authorities took very seriously these allegations. They were worried that there could be some truth in them. And then there was a police investigation, a complete collaboration with the FBI and with the Canadian police. And that was one direction. But the other was that the scientific community, and especially the Academy of Science, Cuban Academy of Sciences, felt the need to examine this problem, which was obviously going to have very negative impact between the relationship between two countries. There have been excellent moments during the Obama administration. We were prepared that Trump was going to reverse things, and we were worried that this could be an excuse. Mm-hmm. And the first thing we did is read, all was published. We received very little information from the U.S., a short clinical history, and we started examining what was being reported and what was being published. And obviously, from the very first moment, we started seeing incongruity and things that were evidently false. First, the idea of a sonic attack to damage somebody's brain, which is what the idea, with sound, you probably destroy all the ear before. That was really stupid. The only way somebody could really be harmed if they would stand a long time next to a jet engine. It's a very large amount of noise. And the other thing is that if somebody was using loud noise, why did anyone else hear it? No Cuban, no foreign person, no tourist visit. Nobody heard these noises. And which is a sort of confusion in some people's mind, because they are sonic weapons for crowd control. There are these big speakers, and then you blast a very large sound there, and the idea is people get uncomfortable and then they disperse. But that's something that's noticeable. And the other thing is what the persons complaining of symptoms were reporting did not mention anything of the sort. So it couldn't be sound. Then they started searching, because I think the idea is that it was like a policy decision. There has been an attack, let's find the evidence. That's what some people in the United States needed. They wanted that. And then science starts going sour when you go from a preordained conclusion, and then you make everything try to fit that conclusion. So then we read the articles that were being published by this group in Pennsylvania, UPenn, and later on by the first doctor that was at Miami, and they were describing a new brain disorder. And immediately there was something very fishy, something very strange in this. Well, they published it in JAMA, the Journal of American Medical Association, which is a very high-level journal. And if you try to publish in these high-level journals, and you make just one or two mistakes, they kick you out. And the JAMA felt the need to publish an editorial, a commentary, that outlined about 20, let's say, shortcomings of the article. That's very strange. I mean, the only explanation for this is there was some kind of pressure or some kind of need to have that published. But then when we read the content of the article, immediately it was full of things that were impossible. They did neuropsychological tests, and then they used a criterion of who was sick that is something that's never been used in medicine. And if you use that same criteria, you do some computer simulations like Professor de la Sala from Edinburgh did, 100% of everybody would have the syndrome, right? So completely absurd use of statistics and way they manage. Second, they were claiming that the auditory systems were very important, but when you looked at the results of the auditory tests, most of them were normal. And the ones they did publish, when you looked at the graphs, they were completely different forms. Some had loss in high frequency, some in low frequency. And if there's a common cause, for example, if a group of people is exposed to a very loud noise, say of a certain frequency, everybody will have a similar audiogram, loss at that frequency. So the idea that there was something common to that, with time, we learned that many of those cases either had brain trauma, or some sort of brain disorder or hearing disorder previous to coming to Cuba. Then they published a paper also in JAMA about the neuroimaging. And though the first paper said that the neuroimaging was normal, they would do more sophisticated tests. We talked to editors from several scientific journals that the article, they had seen it, and they just commented, unacceptable. And when it was published, they made use, first they didn't use an adequate control group. They didn't exclude people with previous history of problems, related to neurological disorders. And when they did eliminate that group in the analysis, that's a footnote almost, the effects disappeared. And the reaction of all the scientists several British scientists talked about this, is that this is complete nonsense. So that's on record. They went on record in newspapers. So we saw no real evidence. And when you look at it, it was a mixed grab of different symptoms. And we looked at a paper published by the U.S. Service for Medical Services for their diplomats, and many of the things, the complaints like dizziness, sleep disorders, headaches. The study was published a few years before all this, before the so-called Havana syndrome, and these are the most prevalent disorders in that kind of personnel. So our conclusion, and the Cuban Academy of Science discussed this deeply, and we organized a meeting in Havana. We invited scientists from different parts of the world to give their opinion, and we reached the conclusion that this was not a new syndrome. It was not coherent. Second, it was not due to any kind of microwave or sound, because microwaves, you'd have to burn the skin to get to the brain, and that there was no evidence of an attack. Nobody could really point the finger to attack. So we sent that out to all the world. It was ignored by many of the mainstream media that were sold on the idea that there had been attacks. But to our surprise, a couple of years later, 7 intelligence agencies in the United States met, assessed spending millions of dollars, all the cases that had cropped up all over the world. It was like a pandemic of this, and we think was psychogenic. But and then the report of the intelligence services in the U.S. is that there was no new disease, no syndrome. It's the people had real problems, but attributable to different disorders. There was no evidence of any energy weapon. So exactly the same conclusions as Cuba. I mean, we could have used that $1 million they did, but for that study, we would have produced more vaccines for poor people. But well, they spend it on that. Now, this is a story that should be dead, but there are people interested in keeping it alive. And then recently there was this absurd program that even received a Grammy, I think, and 30 minutes, 60 minutes, one of these programs in the U.S., where they present evidence of Russians that were behind all this. And the evidence is very flimsy. And the idea that the Cuban government, which has defended its independence and the sovereignty of the country against all odds, and at a tremendous price, would accept that some Russians were running around in Havana with some sort of energy gun. This is absurd. Because if you talk to the enemies of the revolution, they say, oh, the Cuban police is so efficient that it represses everyone. So you can't. So the question is, if our police is so efficient, and the Cuban government had an invested interest in working with the U.S. for better relationships. In fact, this is one of the last achievements of Raúl as president. So the idea that Cuba would permit that's absurd. And all this is a fantasy that has been driven by people that want to hurt Cuba, especially the lobby in Cuban lobby in the U.S. Congress. One of the first sponsors of this was Marco Rubio, and you can just judge how much you can trust Marco Rubio, but what he's doing now in the Trump administration. And so that lobby was very interested for this happening, and of course, they're the people who are affected, and their lawyers that believe they have to be compensated, and they're convinced that something happened to them, and nobody has helped them. This is interesting because the last thing they should have shut this down for, the whole problem is that the NIH studied a large group and of these people complaining of Havana syndrome, and when they published the results, also in JAMA, 2 papers, they found essentially nothing, except evidence for something that's called it's a kind of disorder where symptoms that people have are amplified. It's a functional neurological disorder. And they did find evidence of that. So it's the real medical condition. These people were affected. But the first thing you do in a functional neurological disorder is the figures of authority have to try to make the patient easy, confident he's going to be better, and try to work against all the negative things. And what the medical establishment that worked with the government did, and the government authorities did, was say, you guys have been attacked by a mysterious weapon that nobody knows how it works. So that's the opposite of reassuring the patient and trying to get so he can feel better. And I think all the medical evidence is clear that this is not a new disease, and the only way you can really and the engineering of a supposed weapon of this seems to be impossible. I think this is just something that's kept alive by people who are interested in using it against Cuba.
Now to talk about something more positive, perhaps. Cuba's currently developing free medical products for people suffering from Alzheimer's. The most advanced is Neuroscience. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. What can you tell us about this product and why it's inspiring so much hope and enthusiasm?
Well, a treatment for Alzheimer's disease and for dementia at this point has very limited options. So the idea of new approaches is something that everybody's interested in examining. And there's some drugs that manage the memory loss and other problems at the early stages. They're symptomatic, but they don't attack, let's say, the basic mechanisms of the development of the disease. So they can only improve symptoms, but not really slow down the course of the disease. And there's been some recent work, and some recent drugs have been approved that use monoclonal antibodies to attack beta amyloid, which is the toxic protein that accumulates in the brain during Alzheimer's disease. And they've had some success. There's still not enough evidence to say that it completely halts the development of the disease, but there has been improvement in patients. But these are drugs that are very costly, that a percentage of the cases have presented complications. It has its risks. Even there have been some few deaths. And you have to go to get injection periodically in the hospital or the clinic, wherever you're receiving the treatment. So many doctors, I've spoken to many scientists that feel that these two drugs they're encouraging, but they're not the solution for the over 35 million people that will have Alzheimer's disease in the year 2030. So the approaches Cuba has taken is to examine other targets and other ways of working with disease. There's one molecule, as you said, Neuroscience, has another name, Neuroscience, that acts on these receptors that are in the brain, that are erythropoietin receptors. And they help work with inflammation and neurodegeneration, and they slow down. And the clinical trials up to now have been very encouraging. First, very few side effects. And the cases, they've done clinical trials with, controls and with other treatments, to compare. And the groups that have been treated with Neuroscience have an initial improvement and then a steady course without a deterioration of their cognitive functions. And this is very encouraging. I mean, we still don't know which cases would benefit most, because no treatment is universal. Alzheimer's is not really one disease, it's a collection of diseases. And then you have all the other dementias. So we really have very complex classification of different forms of dementia. From the trials in Cuba, a large number, the majority, can benefit. But something we're now trying to learn in Cuba is if we can select the cases that would benefit most, and know which cases will not benefit, which is something that when you have a good treatment, you try to do to reduce cost and not affect people, getting their hopes up if they will not benefit from this disorder. There are two other drugs in development. One is by the Center for Development of Drugs in Cuba, Medicines in Cuba, CIDEN. That's a combination of two molecules that each has an action. One is on calcium flux in the brain, and the other is on these receptors that have to do with excitation. And when they get overexcited, that's part of the things that happens during Alzheimer's disease, that there's a hyper activation that leads to a cell death. And they've developed a molecule that has these two parts, and they finished all the preclinical work, or almost, and should begin a clinical trial beginning next year. And the third one is from our center. It's a drug. It's a chemical, small molecule that seems to have extremely low toxicity. It's relatively easy to manufacture, should be thus inexpensive, and it acts on beta amyloid just like the monoclonal antibodies, from Biogen and from Eli Lilly. But it also acts on a receptor, which is now important, called the sigma-1 receptor. And in all the animal models, it's given very good results. We're now completing toxicology, and we also should be reaching this clinical stage, let's say clinical trials beginning next year. And the idea of working on this, and there's also a drug developed by the Center for Genetic Engineering, CIGB. It's called CIGB 845. This is for stroke or for micro strokes, because many cases have Alzheimer's disease and they have vascular disorders also, and the two interact. So we're really developing, let's say, a panel of molecules. And as I said, since this is a complex condition, dementia, and even Alzheimer's disease is just one of the dementias, has different subtypes. We feel that probably if we have an arsenal of different drugs that act in different actions in the brain, we can use it, one drug for one patient, another for another, or maybe even combine them in certain ways to improve the outcome of the patients. This is a very important problem for Cuba because our population is growing rapidly older. We're going to be the country with the largest proportion of people over 60 by the year 2030 in this hemisphere. So the problem of aging is is now being looked at in a national government program. It's called the Committee for Demographic Change. The Prime Minister Marrero is the person in charge of this, but he has contributions, and we have interacted with this committee through the Academy of Sciences, trying to find solutions for this. So I think that it's very, very promising, the work that's being done on dementia, and Cuban patients probably beginning next year, when the second large clinical trial of Neuroepo is finished, we'll be able to use it. In fact, the SECMED already gave, which is our FDA, SECMED already gave an approval for use, for provisional use, and then it will become permanent, and then a lot of Cubans will be able to benefit from this.
Yeah, you've outlined some of the most incredible innovations that not only are important, obviously, for Cuba, but for the world. So now I just want to talk a little bit about the blockade. Can you describe to me how the blockade affects the neuroscience and
Sure.
more in general, the medical science?
The blockade, it was always tough, but it got worse after the first Trump administration, and when they put Cuba on the list of sponsors of terrorism, something that's it's an absurd accusation. It's just a political tool. We can't buy equipment that's made in the U.S. We can't buy materials for the lab made in the U.S. If we're going to design equipment let's say we need a component from the U.S., we can't acquire it. And I have to say that any equipment, medical equipment you see in the world today has parts from all over the world because it's become global. If we want to buy, let's say, an important new piece of machinery, they check if it has more than 10% of U.S. If it has 11%, we can't buy it, or we have to ask for permission. All this leads to delays, but it goes much beyond that. For example, there's an organization called the Organization of Open Science. It's called Open Science Foundation. The idea is that science has to be more transparent. So people should, the data they use to make a scientific report or a scientific article, they should place it on some place on the internet so everybody can go get the data and repeat the analysis to see if there's some mistake, and usually there are mistakes. If they use some software code, right? You use that software code and you can do your own experiment and replicate, which is very important. In science, replication is important. It's incredible the number of experiments that apparently are teaching us something new, and they haven't got it exactly right. And then the replication is important. Well, it's a oxymoron that the Foundation for Open Science does not let Cuba download data from there. And so it's open science for all the world except Cuba. We contribute to these international databases because every year it's become mainstream that people share their data, because then you can collect data from a lot. You can reach more solid conclusions. For example, MRIs. Now the analyses that are being done in MRIs are not in 30 or 40 as used to be the norm, right? So people now work with thousands of MRIs. Say that they're trying to develop a technique to detect dementia or at early stages. They don't work with 10, 30, 40. They work with thousands. So people also place in these international databases their data so other people can use it. Of course, there has to be the consent of the patient. So you have to anonymize it. You have to, protect the privacy of the patient. We have contributed data. There was a publication 3 years ago in Nature. It was a big study with 100,000 MRIs, and among the authors are several of our colleagues. And we contributed data. We can't download the data from the place we contributed.
They're blocking information.
They're blocking information. And I can mention other things. It's very difficult to download scientific articles. And now it's gotten worse with Trump too. It's gotten worse because people are scared. I used to write to American scientists asking for a copy of a paper or their opinion on something, and 100% or 90% will respond. Now it's 50 or 40%. People are scared.
What are they scared of?
What?
What are they scared of?
They're scared, since there's so many scientists that are foreign-born and so many postdocs that are foreign-born, they're probably are afraid of being kicked out, because there have been so many cases recently, and there's this offensive against students from other countries, which is the United States is shooting itself in the feet, its own foot is shooting with this. I can give another example. We've bought pieces of equipment, very expensive pieces of equipment, from Germany. And when we try to get the spare parts, they officially should not subscribe to the U.S. sanction. In fact, the European Union has laws against that. The United States cannot force their laws on other countries. But they tell us we have a lot of business in the U.S. and we don't want to get into trouble. So sometimes for many people, they hear, even in Cuba, they hear blockade, and they're a little tired of hearing about that. And since many times it's invisible, they feel it can't be that important. I give another example. Cuba has money. They say, for example, BioCubaFarma exports vaccines. It gets money, and that money is going to use it to buy material to manufacture pills for hypertension, for diabetes, for all these diseases that I repeat, the Cuban people receive at subsidized prices, very cheap. Then we try to make the transfer to the company that's going to sell us the material, and the banks won't work with us because we're on the list of countries that are sponsors of terrorism. So there's always discussion in every society if we're being successful, if our model is adequate, and of course there's a discussion, well, socialism in Cuba, is it a success story or is it a failure? And I think the jury is out. We have a lot of things we can show and say, this is good, we did it well. Some things not so well. But what really is a success is the U.S. attempt to crush a country through economic sanctions. And that's their goal, is to overthrow the Cuban Revolution by driving the people to desperation. And they've been very successful in making life difficult in Cuba, extremely difficult, with no justification. And this is something that is what we can discuss merits and demerits of the Cuban system, of socialism, whatever. I think there are enough good things to fight for socialism in Cuba. But what is not on the discussion for me is that the cruelty that the United States has displayed towards Cuba is inexcusable. And it's really gone to extremes because it's 60 years or more than 60 years of sanctions. And if any country in South America would have been just a small part of the sanctions that the United States has applied to Cuba, there would be an economic crisis without proportions, and a lot of people would be dying, and it would be terrible. So this is something that I think is unfortunate. I think we should really alert the world that this crime against Cuba is being committed, and that it goes through invisible, sometimes, mechanism. For example, they're scaring off tourists. So a country that had tourism as part of its main sources of income, if you're European and you come to Cuba, then it's more difficult to get the visa for the U.S. Scientists used to come to Cuba to meet scientific meetings. Some very honest people said, I'm afraid of going because they could have problems with the U.S. So it's a bully that's really projecting in an aggressive way this policy towards Cuba, and it's scaring a lot of people.
The thing is, you talked about it's a crime against Cuba, but we can also see it as a crime against the global population. So if we take the example of Cuba's Heprapop P, the medicine for diabetic foot ulcers.
Yeah.
And that leads to, there are over 50,000 amputations every year just in the United States.
Right.
And 73% of those people would probably be spared the need for an amputation if they had access to the cure.
That's very clear, because if Heprapop P was treated in the same way other scientific developments are treated around the world, it would be within the reach of many people in the world. And there's so many amputations, I can say easily millions of amputations a year, because diabetes is very frequent, and diabetic foot ulcers are very, very frequent. So the U.S. is attacking Cuba and is harming other people, but it's also very clear they have a war against Cuban medical brigades. Why? Because it's a source of income and a source of prestige. So instead of sending soldiers abroad, military bases like the U.S., what we have is medical brigades. And they're helping the underserved populations of their countries, because Cuban doctors work where other people will not work. The other doctors, because they want to make more money. And this is under attack, a ferocious attack from the U.S., but because their policy is to cut off every source of income that Cuba has. to provoke starvation, if possible, and then come as heroes. And it's like an analogy I once heard that it's like a bully in your neighborhood comes and closes all surrounds your house with thugs, and then it starts telling the people inside the house that let's say the parents are guilty and responsible, and trying to provoke a rebellion inside the house. This is exactly the policy of the U.S. It's strangle the Cuban economy. Because I think they're very concerned. It's a mixture of things, but one of them is that an example of a successful country in Latin America, independent from the U.S., and with the kind of policies, social policies, the kind of social organization Cuba has, they don't want to see that. They want that to fail.
Can I ask you an unscripted questions as well? But I want to ask you, you mentioned that if it was any other country in Latin America had these sanctions, that it would collapse. It would collapse. Why, in your opinion, has Cuba not, it's not only just survived, you have made, and you've described just a few, so many advances, and not just advances in medical science, but in so many other sectors. Why is that under the strangulating sanctions? Why?
Because it's part of, Biden, when he was president, he spoke about the Cuban efforts to combat, COVID out of ignorance. But he said that the United States would give Cuba the COVID vaccines if it was distributed by an organization independent from the state. Now, this is just part, I think, of the cognitive decline that he started having. This was an interview with Angela Merkel. But the first thing is that our organization for distributing vaccines is better than the U.S. because we have over 98% of all the children have vaccination, almost 100%, and that's not the case in the U.S. So we have very efficient public health system, a system that reaches every part of the country. So, but they don't want to recognize that because the U.S. formula is make bucks and that's it. Let's make money, and then if they make that fail, the example goes away, and then you have to go the route that many countries in South America are going to over expensive health organizations, private sector, that are really siphoning money out of the people, because their goal is to make money. It's not to make people healthier. And so our example is some, and Biden's words, in his words, we have to distribute the vaccines. Well, the first thing is we didn't need their vaccines because Cuba made its own vaccines. And second, the best way to reach everybody in Cuba with vaccines is to go through a public health system organization. And it's not only a public health system, the volunteers. For example, this center, another thing it did during the COVID vaccine is we turned our clinical area into a vaccination center. And we vaccinated people from around here, and people from the centers, and people from the neighborhoods. And that was a collaboration. It's a kind of collaboration you could obtain with the social structure fabric of our country. They really want Cuba's model to fail. I had an interview here with some people from the U.S. They came to learn about Cuba. And when I started talking about the difficulties that we had getting money to produce our medicines, our subsidized medicines for the human population, due to the U.S. blockade, one of the persons asked me, why don't you privatize medicine production? So it's the idea they have here that privatization is a private sector is the only thing that works. And the Cuban example is that we can help the population. The whole population will benefit independently of their economic status, of their salaries, with our publicly funded medicine manufacturing facilities. And this idea, simply, they can't even imagine it, you know. The irony of this is that when we had a lot of our medicines being produced regularly, before the COVID pandemic and before the tightening of the blockade, Cubans that live in Miami would come to Cuba, buy the medicines that were subsidized, then go sell it in the U.S. at a higher price. Because even being sold at a higher price that they acquired in Cuba, they were lower. The prices were lower than what. And that is something that I think that doesn't sit well in the brain of people in the U.S. policymakers. I mean, their whole way of seeing life is that everything has to be profit-driven. And it's getting worse now.
So the last question, and we can add anything else you wish as well. What are the greatest accomplishments of the Neuroscience Centre and the medical sector?
Well, the Cuban Center of Neuroscience is very proud of several things we have done over the years. The first is that we created the specialty for clinical neurophysiology. And we now coordinate the program for training clinical neurophysiologists. And we also enable the country to have neurophysiology labs in all the provinces and all the major hospitals by manufacturing that equipment and then giving it to the hospitals or selling it at prices that they could afford. And the very first thing we did there, which I think was the most important impact that gave us the support of the government for creating all this network of clinical neurophysiology labs, that we set up early screening of hearing loss. So we manufactured a system with a computer, with some amplifiers, and it was an Apple computer that we smuggled in from the U.S. And then we attached the amplifiers, and then we developed a test for hearing loss by recording the electrical activity of the brain. And this program then was extended all over the country. Now we have new versions of that kind of equipment, but many young children that were born, with hearing loss, or we managed to detect them on time and help them get the attention they needed so they could learn to speak and they could have normal, behavior and cognitive development. The other thing we're pretty proud of is that we helped organize the cochlear implant program in Cuba. I was visiting Colombia, and we found some cochlear implants were being made there when the government was funding this in Colombia. And we made an exchange. So we'll give you equipment for early detection of hearing loss. You teach us how to do cochlear implants and give us some implants. And that started off the cochlear implant program. That later received support from Fidel, because Fidel learned about this. We talked to him, and he started searching for funds. We helped the Colombians set up a screening program. But there was a change of government, and I went to talk with the new president of the Social Security Institute, which they've dismantled, but it was the strongest institute, possibly of all South America. And the new president had me explain what we were doing and our equipment for detection of it. He said, wait a moment, you're going to detect people that are deaf, and then I have to take care of them. No, I'm not interested. So detecting children at an early age, he saw it as a cost that would come at it, and not the cost of society, because if you don't take care of the child, then it'll be much more difficult for him to earn a life for his family and for society. So you have to do the preventive action, and that's a clear example, very clear example of the different policies between this conservative government in Colombia and the policies in Cuba. For us, this idea of detecting children is an obligation. Everybody feels it's necessary. We have to help these kids. and that's the problem of profit-driven medical attention, right? It got worse later on when Uribe, he was a senator, and he proposed a law that dismantled all that and turned everything into a model just like the U.S. And the problem is now medical attention is plummeted in Colombia. It has very high level centers for the people that have money, but for the broader population, it's not as good as it should be. But this is a government that the U.S. is pleased with it. You know, this is a good policy, right? So it's true. I mean, I think we could live on reasonable terms with the U.S., though our views are very different. And this is one example of the difference in views. We believe that human beings have to be supported. Someone has a problem. It's like Ebert Brot. If a child, if a person has a diabetic person has an ulcer, and we can avoid amputating, we're in the duty of doing so. But the United States, these considerations of political profit, because evidently in the U.S. there's a sector of politicians that their career is based on Cuba bashing, right? And that's their whole career. And then I visited the U.S. last year, and they were discussing in Congress sanctions against any scientist that collaborated with a lab in Cuba or in China or whatever. They would not provide federal funds. And of course, it's the biggest grants are so this is another example of the blockade. So lots of scientists. I was talking to several scientists around the States about these products I mentioned about Alzheimer's disease, Neuro-EPO, Neuro-201, JM20, the different molecules, and they were very excited. One famous professor of neurology said, if just part of this is true, this could be a game changer. But no one was able to follow up any possibility of collaboration because they were online because they would lose the principal part of their research funding. It wasn't approved, but in this government now, Trump too, when he gets around to it, they're going to approve it because he has a rubber stamp, Congress. And we have Marco Rubio as Secretary of State.
That has been fantastic. We covered so much ground, and we've learned so much, and I'm sure the audience will too. So thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely, and yeah, emotional but wonderful. Thank you so much.